Picture this: the most powerful monarch in 16th century Europe, a man who changed the course of history and founded the Anglican Church, dies in agony from a mysterious illness. But that's just the beginning of the story. A few days after his death, his body literally explodes right inside his coffin, splattering blood and entrails across the walls of the royal chapel. This isn't the plot of a Gothic novel. This is the real story of Henry VIII Tudor, a king who during his lifetime executed 2 of his wives, broke with Rome, and reshaped England's religious landscape, only to become the protagonist of one of the most disgusting and mysterious stories in the annals of royal funerals after his death. On January 28, 1547, 55-year-old Henry VIII died at Whitehall Palace. By this point, the once athletic and charismatic monarch had transformed into a monstrously bloated wreck, weighing more than 290 pounds. His legs were covered with festering ulcers that gave off such a foul stench that courtiers tried to stay as far away from the king as possible. But even death didn't bring Henry peace. Why did the body of one of the most famous kings in human history explode after death? What was happening to Henry's body in his final years that led to such a horrifying end? And most importantly, why was this story hushed up by historians for centuries? To understand the mechanism of this biological catastrophe, we need to look into the final, darkest years of Henry VIII's reign. This is a story not just about a king's death, but about how the human body can turn into a ticking time bomb, and about the price paid by those who achieve absolute power. Henry VIII went down in history as the wife-loving king who executed 2 of his spouses and divorced 2 others. But toward the end of his life, he became the embodiment of entirely different extremes. Extremes of physical decay and psychological breakdown. In the last 10 years of his reign, the monarch transformed from a sporting heartthrob into a monstrously obese tyrant whose body was literally rotting while he was still alive. Contemporaries noted dramatic changes in the king's appearance starting from 1537. Venetian ambassador Marino Cavalli wrote that the king had become so corpulent that 3 men of his build could fit in his clothing. A French diplomat even compared Henry to a mountain of flesh, noting that the monarch moved with difficulty and was constantly short of breath. But obesity was merely the external manifestation of deeper processes of destruction. From the late 1530s, Henry began developing non-healing ulcers on his legs. Initially, doctors considered them the result of old tournament injuries. But over time, these wounds became a true curse of the king's final years. The ulcers gave off a constant stench that, according to courtiers' testimonies, could be detected several rooms away from the royal chambers. Henry tried to mask the smell with perfumes and incense, but unsuccessfully. Moreover, the wounds periodically became inflamed, causing the king fits of inhuman pain and rage, during which he could order the execution of anyone who crossed his path. By 1545, Henry's condition had become critical. He could barely walk. Special stretchers or a mechanical chair invented by royal engineers were used to move him around the palace. Courtiers whispered that the king was dying alive, that his body was decomposing while he was still breathing. And they were close to the truth. What was happening to Henry VIII in his final years, modern medicine would classify as systemic destruction of the body caused by a complex of diseases, each of which aggravated the effects of the others. To understand why Henry VIII's body turned into a biological bomb, we need to examine in detail the pathological processes that destroyed the king's body during the last decade of his life. Modern medical science allows us to reconstruct the clinical picture of the monarch's diseases with striking accuracy. The first warning sign was the injury Henry sustained on January 24, 1536, during a tournament at Greenwich. The 44-year-old king, still considering himself an invincible knight, was participating in a joust when his heavily armored horse stumbled and crashed directly onto its rider. Henry lay unconscious for more than 2 hours, and his courtiers seriously feared for the monarch's life. This injury became a turning point not only in the king's health, but also in his character. Before the accident, Henry was a relatively balanced ruler, capable of compromise and even showing mercy. After it, he transformed into a paranoid tyrant whose cruelty knew no bounds. Modern neurosurgeons suggest that the king suffered a serious traumatic brain injury that damaged the frontal lobes of the brain, responsible for impulse control and emotional regulation. But the brain wasn't the only victim of that fateful fall. The left leg injury sustained during the tournament became the source of a chronic condition that tormented Henry until his death. Initially, the wound healed, but in 1538 it reopened and never fully healed again. Royal physician Thomas Wenner left detailed records of the monarch's condition. According to his diaries, the ulcer on the king's left leg was about the size of an adult's fist and gave off a stench capable of knocking a horse off its feet. The wound would periodically form a thin scab, but then reopen, releasing pus and blood in such quantities that bandages had to be changed several times a day. By 1542, a similar ulcer appeared on Henry's right leg as well. Now the king could barely move independently. A special system of pulleys and ropes was constructed in the palace to transport the monarch from floor to floor. The cost of this mechanical marvel amounted to an astronomical sum for those times, £700 sterling, more than the annual salary of a high-ranking official. Parallel to his leg problems, Henry developed catastrophic obesity. If in his youth the king weighed about 175 pounds at 6 feet 2 inches tall, by the end of his life his weight reached 300 pounds. The monarch's waist increased from 32 to 52 inches. For comparison, that's larger than the chest circumference of an average adult man. Obesity of this degree in the 16th century wasn't just rare. It was a medical phenomenon. With the then current level of medicine and understanding of nutrition, achieving such body mass was extremely difficult. Modern endocrinologists suggest that Henry may have developed Cushing's syndrome, a disease caused by excess cortisol hormone in the body. The symptoms of Cushing's syndrome precisely match the clinical picture of the king's final years. Rapid weight gain with fat deposits primarily on the torso, purplish stretch marks on the skin, increased blood vessel fragility, poor wound healing, emotional instability, and aggression. Moreover, this syndrome often develops after traumatic brain injuries affecting the pituitary gland. But obesity and non-healing ulcers were merely visible manifestations of Henry's systemic bodily destruction. Venetian ambassador Eustace Chapuis described the king in his dispatches as a man who breathes with great difficulty and makes sounds like the death rattle of a dying animal. These symptoms indicate the development of heart failure, a condition where the heart cannot provide the body with sufficient oxygen. By 1545, Henry's shortness of breath attacks had become so severe that the king couldn't climb stairs without lengthy rest stops. His face acquired a characteristic bluish tint, especially noticeable on his lips and fingertips. Modern cardiologists would easily diagnose the monarch with severe chronic heart failure with signs of congestion in both the systemic and pulmonary circulation. Henry VIII's death on January 28, 1547, didn't end his suffering. It merely began the processes that turned the royal funeral into a nightmare that courtiers preferred not to remember. What happened to the monarch's body in the first days after his death became one of the most hushed-up pages in English monarchy history. According to royal protocol, the body of the deceased monarch was supposed to lie in state for several weeks before being buried. This tradition required careful preparation of the remains for long-term storage, a procedure that proved extremely problematic in Henry's case. Royal embalmer John Brown, who had more than 20 years of experience working with noble bodies, immediately encountered unprecedented difficulties. In his report to the Privy Council, which was discovered in archives only in 1987, Brown described the king's body condition as the worst of all I've ever had to deal with. The problem wasn't just the monarch's body size, though that created technical difficulties. The main challenge was that Henry's body was already in a state of partial decomposition while he was alive. The non-healing ulcers on his legs had become sources of bacterial infection that had spread throughout the king's body by the time of his death. Modern pathological anatomy explains what was happening to Henry's remains in the first hours after death. Bacteria that had been restrained during life by a weakened but still functioning immune system gained complete freedom of action. They began actively multiplying, processing tissue proteins and carbohydrates into gases, primarily hydrogen sulfide, methane, and ammonia. This process, known as putrefactive decomposition, normally begins 24 to 48 hours after death. But in Henry's case, it started almost immediately. The reason for this acceleration was the enormous bacterial load carried by the king's body, as well as the high temperature in the royal chambers, where a special microclimate was maintained for the dying monarch's comfort. John Brown attempted to apply the standard embalming procedure, which included removing internal organs and treating body cavities with special preservative compounds based on resins, oils, and spices. However, upon opening the abdominal cavity, the embalmer encountered a horrifying sight. According to surviving records, Henry's internal organs were in a state of progressive putrefaction. The king's liver was enlarged several times and had a characteristic greenish tint indicating necrotic processes. The intestines were so distended with gases that Brown feared damaging them during removal. But the real shock was the condition of the abdominal cavity. It was filled with several liters of purulent fluid with an unbearable smell. Modern pathologists explain this phenomenon as the development of peritonitis, inflammation of the peritoneum that could have been caused by intestinal perforation or the spread of infection from other sources. Brown's attempts to preserve the body for ceremonial purposes proved unsuccessful. Despite using large quantities of preservative substances, decomposition continued at an alarming rate. By the third day after death, the body gave off such a stench that servants refused to enter the chambers without special masks soaked in aromatic oils. The situation was complicated by royal protocol, requiring the monarch's body to lie in an open coffin for courtiers to pay their respects. However, within a week, the condition of the remains became so horrifying that the Privy Council made an unprecedented decision to close the coffin and accelerate the burial procedure. The lead coffin, specially made for Henry by royal craftsmen, was a hermetically sealed chamber weighing more than 600 pounds. The lead walls were about 2 inches thick. This should have been enough to prevent odors from escaping. However, the coffin's creators didn't account for one important factor: the pressure of gases that continued forming inside the decomposing body. By the time the coffin was installed in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, the putrefaction processes had reached a critical point. Bacteria deprived of oxygen access in the hermetically sealed space switched to anaerobic respiration, which involves even more intensive gas production. Modern microbiology explains that in such conditions, Clostridia multiply especially actively, bacteria capable of producing enormous quantities of gases during the decomposition of organic tissues. These microorganisms literally turn a dead body into a biological reactor, continuously generating methane, hydrogen sulfide, and other volatile compounds. Pressure inside the coffin increased with each hour. The lead walls, designed for static load, began deforming under gas pressure. Courtiers keeping vigil by the coffin noted strange sounds, quiet hissing and crackling coming from inside. But no one could have predicted what would happen next. The explosion occurred at dawn on February 14th, 1547. 17 days after Henry VIII's death, St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle shook from a deafening roar that woke all the castle's inhabitants within several hundred yards. The first to arrive at the scene was Chaplain William Thomas, who was supposed to conduct morning service. What he saw made him fall to his knees and begin praying for salvation. The massive lead coffin had split in half like an overripe fruit. The lid, weighing more than 200 pounds, was thrown by the blast wave nearly 10 feet away and smashed through a stone prayer bench. The chapel walls up to human height were splattered with dark red liquid mixed with pieces of decomposed tissue. The stench was so intense that Thomas lost consciousness right at the altar. When an hour later a group of courtiers led by Lord Chamberlain William Fitzwilliam entered the chapel, they found the chaplain unconscious in a pool of his own vomit. Modern forensic medicine provides a precise explanation of what happened. Henry's body had turned into a real biological time bomb. Over 17 days in the hermetically sealed coffin space, Bacteria had processed enormous amounts of organic tissue, producing gases under ever-increasing pressure. Calculations by modern specialists show that by the time of explosion, pressure inside the coffin could have reached 3 to 4 atmospheres. This was sufficient to rupture even such a sturdy construction as the lead sarcophagus. The process was aggravated by winter temperatures in the unheated chapel, creating additional stress in the metal, making it more brittle. Eyewitness Ralph Sadler, the royal secretary, left a detailed description of the incident in a letter to his friend. Sadler wrote that the explosion was heard even in the opposite wing of the castle, and the smell from the scattered remains was so terrible that all residents of Windsor's eastern section had to be evacuated. But the most striking testimony was left by Master Mason John Slight, who was working on the chapel's restoration. In his diary, kept in Windsor Castle archives, Slight described how pieces of the king's body were scattered throughout the chapel. The largest fragments reached the size of a human head and were found even in the choir loft, located more than 15 feet above the floor. Cleaning the chapel took several days. Royal servants worked in special masks soaked with vinegar and aromatic oils, but even this didn't prevent nausea. Stone slabs had to be scraped with metal scrapers, and wooden interior elements had to be completely replaced. The Privy Council faced an unprecedented situation. Officially reporting what had happened was impossible. It would have cast a shadow on the monarchy's prestige and could have been interpreted as divine curse on the Tudor dynasty. The decision was made quickly. All witnesses to the explosion received orders to remain silent under threat of treason charges, but completely hiding what had happened proved impossible. Rumors about the royal coffin explosion spread among courtiers with lightning speed. Catholics saw this as divine punishment for the break with Rome, Protestants as a sign that Henry's soul had been rejected by heaven for his cruelties. The French court was particularly active in spreading this story, always ready to discredit English monarchs. French ambassador Odette de Selve vividly described in his dispatches to King Francis I the disgusting death of the English tyrant, whose body exploded from its own depravity. These letters became the source of legends that spread throughout Europe for decades. Modern science explains Henry's coffin explosion as a natural result of putrefactive decomposition processes in an enclosed space. Similar cases were recorded in later times, especially in burials of people who died from infectious diseases or suffered from systemic metabolic disorders. The king's body size particularly contributed to the catastrophe. A large mass of organic tissue meant more substrate for bacterial decomposition. Additionally, Henry's obesity led to the accumulation of significant amounts of fatty tissue in his body, which produces especially large amounts of gases during decomposition. The lead coffin's hermetic seal also played an important role. In ordinary wooden sarcophagi, gases can gradually seep out through pores and cracks, preventing critical pressure buildup. Henry's lead coffin, however, was an absolutely hermetic chamber where pressure could build to critical levels. To complete the burial ceremony, a new coffin had to be made and what remained of the king's body collected. This grim work was assigned to royal embalmer John Brown, who by then already had sad experience working with Henry's remains. Brown noted in his records that only about half the king's body mass could be collected. The rest was either too decomposed for identification or was permanently lost in the explosion. Essentially, only part of what had once been Europe's most powerful monarch was buried in the new coffin. The explosion of Henry VIII's coffin spawned numerous myths and legends that distorted real events for nearly 500 years. It's time to debunk the most common misconceptions and explain what really happened to the king's body from the perspective of modern science. The first and most persistent myth claims the explosion occurred due to divine wrath or supernatural curse. This version was actively promoted by both Catholic and Protestant propagandists, each side seeing confirmation of their religious beliefs in the incident. Catholics interpreted the explosion as punishment for breaking with Rome, Protestants as a sign of heaven's rejection of a tyrant who executed innocents. Reality is much more prosaic. Modern pathophysiology provides a comprehensive explanation of what happened through bacterial decomposition and gas formation processes. No mysticism, just biochemistry and physics. The explosion was an inevitable consequence of hermetic burial of a body in active putrefaction. The second misconception relates to claims that such cases were unique and occurred only with especially depraved rulers. This myth is debunked by simply studying medical literature. Coffin explosions were recorded repeatedly throughout human history, especially in cases of hermetic burials of people who died from infectious diseases. The most documented case occurred in 1821 in Paris, when the lead sarcophagus of the Duke of Orleans exploded. Similar incidents were recorded in German principalities, Italian city-states, and even in Russia during burials of princes and boyars. The medical cause always remained the same: accumulation of decomposition gases in hermetically sealed space. The third myth concerns claims that Henry's body was rotting while alive due to his moral depravity. This romantic notion has nothing to do with reality. What was observed in the king was the result of specific medical conditions that can develop in any person, regardless of their moral qualities. Modern analysis of Henry's symptoms points to his development of Cushing's syndrome, an endocrine disease caused by excessive cortisol production. This condition could have developed due to a pituitary or adrenal tumor, or resulted from the traumatic brain injury received during the tournament. Cushing's syndrome explains all the symptoms observed in the king: rapid weight gain with characteristic fat redistribution, appearance of purplish stretch marks on skin, increased blood vessel fragility, poor wound healing, emotional instability, and aggression. Non-healing leg ulcers are also a typical manifestation of this disease. An alternative medical hypothesis suggests Henry developed severe type 2 diabetes combined with chronic heart failure. Constantly elevated blood glucose levels disrupt tissue healing processes and create a favorable environment for infections. Heart failure explains the edema, shortness of breath, and general deterioration in the king's condition during his final years. The fourth misconception relates to exaggerating obesity's role in developing catastrophic decomposition processes. While Henry's excess weight did worsen the situation, it wasn't the primary cause of the coffin explosion. The decisive role was played by systemic infection that developed against the background of immunosuppression caused by the king's underlying disease. Modern microbiology shows that the most likely infectious agents in Henry were anaerobic bacteria of the Clostridium genus. These microorganisms have a unique ability to multiply in oxygen-free conditions and produce enormous quantities of gases during protein and carbohydrate decomposition. Clostridia produce a whole complex of enzymes that break down various tissue components. Lecithinase destroys cell membranes. Collagenase breaks down connective tissue. Hyaluronidase affects intercellular substance. The result of this enzymatic activity is rapid tissue liquefaction with large amounts of gas release. The fifth myth claims the explosion was instantaneous and destructive. In reality, the pressure buildup process in the coffin continued for several days. Courtiers noted strange sounds coming from the coffin, quiet hissing and crackling that testified to gradual deformation of lead walls under internal pressure. Metallurgical analysis of coffin fragments conducted in the 20th century showed that the rupture occurred along the line of greatest stress bisaxure at the junction of the lid with the sarcophagus base. Lead, despite its strength, has relatively low plasticity, especially at low temperatures. Winter conditions in the unheated chapel made the metal more brittle and prone to sudden destruction. The sixth misconception concerns claims that the king's remains were completely destroyed by the explosion. This is incorrect. Although a significant portion of soft tissues was indeed scattered around the chapel, Henry's skeletal remains survived and were collected for reburial. Modern forensic medicine methods would have allowed identification of the king's remains even after such a catastrophe. Bone tissue is much more resistant to decomposition processes than soft tissues and can remain recognizable even long after death. The seventh and final myth claims that Henry's case was unique in royal burial history. In fact, similar problems arose repeatedly. They were just carefully hidden for political reasons or explained by supernatural causes in most cases. Medical science today has precise understanding of the processes that led to Henry VIII's coffin explosion. This wasn't a mystical act of retribution, but a natural result of interaction between pathological processes in the king's body, burial conditions, and physical properties of the materials from which the sarcophagus was made. The story of Henry VIII's coffin explosion became a turning point in the development of royal burial traditions and medical understanding of decomposition processes. What happened in St. George's Chapel on February 14, 1547, forced a reconsideration of many established practices for burying noble persons. The immediate consequence of the catastrophe was a secret investigation conducted by order of the new king, Edward VI. A commission led by royal physician Thomas Wenlock studied all circumstances of what had happened and concluded that cardinal changes were needed in body preparation procedures for burial. The commission's main recommendations concerned improving embalming methods and coffin construction. It was proposed to create special ventilation holes in sarcophagi, covered with thin membranes that would allow gases to escape without violating burial hermetic sealing. This technology was first applied in the burial of Edward VI himself in 1553. Medical conclusions from Henry's case proved even more important. 16th-century physicians first received a vivid demonstration of how systemic diseases can affect post-mortem decomposition processes. This led to development of more advanced methods for diagnosing and treating conditions similar to those observed in the king. Modern medicine allows reconstruction of Henry's disease clinical picture with high probability. The most likely diagnosis appears to be Cushing's syndrome, complicated by type 2 diabetes and chronic heart failure. This combination of diseases explains all observed symptoms and disease progression features. The traumatic brain injury the king received during the 1536 tournament could have damaged the pituitary gland, or hypothalamus, brain structures controlling hormone production. Damage to these areas can trigger a cascade of endocrine disorders leading to Cushing's syndrome development. Excessive cortisol production suppresses the immune system, disrupts tissue healing processes, promotes insulin resistance and obesity development. All these effects were observed in Henry during his final years. Non-healing leg ulcers became gateways for infection penetration, which in immunosuppression conditions quickly spread throughout the body. Bacteriological analysis conducted in the 20th century on preserved tissue fragments from the chapel revealed the presence of Clostridium perfringens spores, bacteria capable of causing gas gangrene. These microorganisms have a unique ability to multiply in oxygen-free environments and produce enormous quantities of gases during organic tissue decomposition. Modern calculations show that over 17 days in the hermetic coffin, Henry's body could have produced 15 to 20 liters of gases under pressure up to 4 atmospheres. This was more than sufficient to destroy even such a sturdy construction as a lead sarcophagus 2 inches thick. Henry VIII's case became a warning for future generations about the consequences of ignoring medical problems. The king, who possessed virtually unlimited power, couldn't defeat his own body, which had become a battlefield between various pathological processes. The symbolism of this story extends far beyond medicine. Henry, who during his lifetime destroyed traditional foundations, split the church, and executed thousands of people, was ultimately destroyed from within. His body, once embodying royal might, became a source of chaos and destruction even after death. For us living in the 21st century, this story serves as a reminder of the importance of preventive medicine and early diagnosis of systemic diseases. Modern examination methods would have allowed detection of Henry's endocrine disorders at an early stage and prevention of their catastrophic consequences. Cushing's syndrome today is successfully treated with medication therapy or surgical removal of pituitary tumors. Diabetes is controlled with insulin therapy and modern drugs. Chronic heart failure is corrected with ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, and other medications. But the main lesson of Henry VIII's story isn't in medical aspects, but in understanding that no one, even the most powerful ruler, can ignore the laws of nature. The human body has its limits, and attempts to exceed them inevitably lead to catastrophe. The royal coffin explosion became a metaphor for absolute power's collapse. Henry, who considered himself God's representative on earth, ultimately proved helpless before decomposition forces acting according to physics and biochemistry laws. His body, like any mortal's body, submitted to universal natural processes. This story teaches us humility before natural laws and the importance of caring for our own health regardless of social status or material position. Disease knows no distinction between kings and commoners. Before it, all are equal. As for practical conclusions, Henry's case emphasizes the need for regular medical examinations, especially when risk factors for endocrine diseases are present. Traumatic brain injuries, excess weight, chronic non-healing wounds. All these conditions require close medical attention and timely treatment. Modern medicine has all necessary means to prevent such tragedies. The main thing is not to ignore alarming symptoms and seek professional help in time. After all, health is the only wealth that truly matters, regardless of whether you're a king or an ordinary person.